Hi everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ. As soon as I finish munching on these M&Ms, we'll begin. We are, these are peanut butter M&Ms. You know, if you put these in the freezer before you eat them, they're pretty good. Chapter 6. I'm eating M&Ms and drinking Red Bull. It's like 10 o'clock at night. But videos must be edited. All right, here we go. Now that I've chewed into my microphone and talked with my mouth full, broken all the rules of etiquette that my mother taught me. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. On the Sabbath day, while he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" Excuse me. So this same story, this incident, is recorded in two other Gospels, Matthew chapter 12 and Mark chapter 2. And I definitely encourage you to go read those accounts if you're working on interpreting this text, because there's some really important statements that Jesus makes that are intertwined with this conversation that are recorded in some of the other Gospels, but not recorded here in Luke's account. So this is pretty common, you know, when you read a story from the Gospels, is that you got to read all of the different accounts to get the full picture of it. We get most of it here, but especially in this case, I think this is a text that's somewhat challenging to interpret, so we need all the information, and it's important. So it was the Sabbath day, it was Saturday, and the Pharisees, they accused Jesus' disciples of doing, quote, work in parenthesis, which was not allowed on the Sabbath day. In the Sabbath day, I guess the precedent for it was really set back during the 7 days of creation. Well, there were 6 days of creation, and then God rested on the seventh day, remember? And then when the law of Moses came along and was given to the Jewish people, God instituted the Sabbath day as a day of rest, and there were some rules about what could and couldn't be done on the Sabbath day, but it was intended for the good of the people as a rest day. As I just mentioned, God had given some specific commands about what could and couldn't be done. However, over the years, and by the time we get to Jesus' day, there were a lot of man-made rules and traditions that had been kind of put into force by some of the Jewish rabbis. And if you've ever been around any kind of religious community, you'll know that traditions have a way of becoming a law after a while. And things that just started off as like, oh, it would be good to do this, turn into you must do this or else you're out of compliance with God's law and God's will, right? Happens in modern churches too. Excuse me. All right. Now, according to these traditions, not God's laws, but these traditions, picking grain and separating the good stuff from the bad stuff and then eating the good stuff, that would fall into the category of, quote, work. However, God had not given any kind of specific laws forbidding that. On any given day of the week, that would have been completely permissible, and on Sabbath, there was no restriction, right? But the Pharisees had an issue because it violated their traditions. You'll find out, though, as we go through the Gospels, and if you've read any of the other ones, you already know this, Jesus wasn't too fond of these man-made traditions that were kind of injected into God's law. So when the Pharisees saw his disciples picking grain, they thought that this was their opportunity. They had stalked him. They'd been watching everything that he was doing, just trying to find anything that would give them some credibility in their accusations against Jesus. And they said, aha, your disciples are breaking the Sabbath law, and you're affirming that it's okay by letting them do this. In the notes, I have a couple pictures of heads of grain. So it might be helpful if you can't quite picture what exactly was going on here. All right, so they think that they've got Jesus. However, Jesus is going to make it clear to them that he doesn't care about their traditions, and God doesn't care about their traditions. And so their point is completely mute. And there's an application here, I think, and that is that we really need to be careful that we don't weaponize religion and weaponize religious devotion. Religious commands are weaponized. When religious commands are weaponized to condemn others while being stripped of any God-focused meaning, then there's a problem. The Pharisees observed the Sabbath day, but they didn't do it with the right heart. They didn't do it as worship and as praise and as a time of meditation on God. They observed the Sabbath day so that they could look down their noses at everyone who didn't keep it as well as they did, and then use it to kind of gain power over those people. And we can observe religious commands without worship in our hearts if we're not careful. We can observe those religious traditions or rituals, or even externally go through the practice of worshiping. We can do that with the best of the Bible followers, but it doesn't mean that we're genuinely worshiping God. Being a Bible authoritarian and a true worshiper are two different things. Being a stickler for the rules and a true worshiper are two different things. Really, we want to be somewhere in the middle of those. Well, we want to have a good balance of both of those things, right? Yeah, of course we want to follow the laws of God and make sure that those are preserved and kept very carefully. But we want to do that with the right heart and make sure that we are observing them in a way that honors God, not a way that's just meant to tear down other people. And they should never become a source of our self-righteousness. And that's what they had to become for the Pharisees. And now, in response to this accusation that he had broken the law, Jesus is going to bring up a story from the Old Testament. It's about David and some holy bread. Okay? And if you're confused, don't worry. Well, I'll give you a quick summary at least. You can read about this story in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. This holy bread that David eats was only supposed to be eaten by the priests. Okay, and God specified that in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 through 9. So let's read this story in the text again just to refresh our minds. Luke 6, verse 3. And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him." So there was this time when David was running for his life, and he was in desperate need of food, and his men needed food, and there wasn't any food around except for this holy bread that they were forbidden from eating. However, David took the bread, or actually it was given to him, and he went ahead and ate it. And you might be like, okay, well, what does this have to do with the Pharisees' accusation that Jesus' disciples have broken Sabbath walking through this grain field? Like, what's the point here? And that's a good question. And this is a text that's been, I guess, debated on a good bit. And I want to present two different interpretations to you, and then I'll let you decide on which you prefer. I'm close to being split down the middle. I do have a preference, and I'll share that preference with you after we talk about both of these interpretations. But I'll try to be as unbiased as I can. So here's interpretation number one. Jesus brought up this story about David and the bread because David's actions were wrong. They were condemnable. However, it seems like the Jewish elite, they held David in such high respect that they didn't like to bring that up, right? They didn't like to talk about that. They kind of whitewashed that from the history books. And the problem here is that while the Pharisees are so quick to condemn Jesus, the people that they like old King David, they don't bring up his faults too often. And he had broken a direct command of God, whereas Jesus had just broken the traditions of the rabbis. And so he would be, in this interpretation, Jesus is pointing out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the fact that they're so slow to condemn David and so quick to condemn him, even though, David's trespass is worse by anyone's account. Okay, that's interpretation number one. Here's the second interpretation of why Jesus could have brought this story up. And that is because David's actions were not condemnable. He didn't do anything wrong. You say, how can that be? He broke an instruction of God about this holy bread. All right. Well, although it's not found in Luke's gospel or Matthew's account of the story, there's a couple key verses, specifically one key verse that's found in Mark that says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And Jesus says this as he's having this very same conversation, just in another gospel account. It says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. There's another statement, I believe it's in Matthew's account, that Jesus says, I would have mercy rather than sacrifice. The Pharisees didn't understand the heart of God's Sabbath command. To them, it was nothing more than a ritual that had to be observed no matter what the cost in human suffering or inconvenience. But Jesus, based on that statement, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, seems to be suggesting that the Pharisees viewed this wrong, that these weren't commands that were to be kept no matter what the cost in human suffering or convenience, right? Because Sabbath had been created for the benefit of men, not to inconvenience them by keeping rules. Men were not created to be servants of the Sabbath day and the laws, but the Sabbath was created as the day of rest for the benefit of the Jews. So in condemning Jesus' disciples, the Pharisees revealed their ignorance of the true heart of the law of God. And so Jesus was saying David hadn't done anything wrong because the circumstances that he was in, where he was running for his life, that there was an exception made, that God even would make an exception for such circumstances, because the Sabbath day was not meant to be oppressive. It wasn't meant to make David's situation worse than it already was. It was made for the benefit of man, and that is the general rule. But he seems to be suggesting that there are some exceptions to that in some extreme circumstances. And that's always, kind of I don't even like that, right? I kind of like black and white. I kind of like just, do what this verse says and don't do anything else. And anyone who does anything else is wrong, and anyone who does this is right? I like that black and white. But the verses that Jesus brings up, namely those two, which I think are key. I would have mercy rather than sacrifice. And Sabbath was not created for man. I always mess this up. Let me read it. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Those seem to suggest, in my view, and my preference as far as interpretations of this is actually the second one, because of those two verses. I don't know how to make sense of those two verses with using interpretation number one. if the verses about David stood alone without any context surrounding them, then I would say interpretation number 1 was correct. But when you account for all the verses and all of the different accounts, I tilt towards interpretation number 2. So if I'd be interested if anyone studied this before, if you've found a way to kind of account for those 2 verses and bring them into interpretation number 1 somehow, I'd be interested in understanding how that was done. Because I'm not a strong number 2. I'm like a leaning that way, but I could be brought back to the other view as well. So that's where I'm at. And hopefully the presentation of those 2 different ideas is somewhat helpful. Maybe somebody else also has a third interpretation. So now, say we're going with interpretation number 2. The disciples hadn't done anything wrong. David hadn't done anything wrong, and he even broke. I don't want to say broke. Jesus would be saying David didn't do anything wrong, and there was a direct instruction from God on that issue, right? But he had an exception. Now, if David didn't do anything wrong, certainly Jesus' disciples weren't doing anything wrong, because they weren't even going, they weren't even in contrast with any of God's instructions. They were only defying the traditions of the rabbis, right? So there's no problem with this situation, is basically what Jesus is saying. My disciples have not done anything wrong, and this story from the Old Testament just ought to reaffirm that to you, you Pharisees. The traditions and the man-made rules of the Pharisees did not originate with God, and therefore they were not to be bound. The disciples only needed to be worried about violating God's commands. Kind of already said that, but and Jesus, as the, quote, Son of Man and the Lord of the Sabbath, did not condemn them. Now, this is a really key statement that I think sometimes we can skip over. Jesus says that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, we know, and the Jews knew, that the Son of Man was a significant title and is one that Jesus took on himself. And he says that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Who instituted Sabbath law? God. If Jesus is Lord of it, if he has authority over those laws, and he has authority to speak about the interpretation of those laws and what is and isn't permissible within those laws that are given, right? Whose authority is he claiming? He's claiming an authority that's equal to the lawgiver, to God himself. And he says, I am supreme over all of those things. And the only way that he could possibly be the Lord of the Sabbath day is to be God himself. And I think when we read in context, especially when you account for all the gospel stories, the Jews understood what he was claiming, and they were mad about it. And so it's not necessarily a direct command or a direct statement that he shares the same nature as God the Father, but it is it's probably about as direct as you could be without just coming out and saying it, right? And the Jews got it, and they were super mad and they wanted to kill him. So don't let somebody tell you that, Jesus never claims to be God. Here he's claiming to have the same authority as God the Father. So that's pretty much a claim to deity. All right. That's a bit of a complicated text, but I think we made some progress in understanding it. Next time we'll take on verses 6 through 11. And until then, have a stupendous day.